Do your renders feel off, but you can't put your finger on why? Hey, my name is TheDizzyViper, and in today's video I'll break down 5 common rendering mistakes and how to fix them, and therefore how to improve your renders. So let's get right into the video. So number 1, we're gonna start off with wrong material properties. What do I mean by that? So I'm sure most of you have used a material library so far, and all of these materials are PBR materials, which come with a displacement map, at least most of them. And actually the displacement map is what most of the time is what's wrong with the material. So if you import these materials into Cinema 4D, they usually get imported with a default value. That default value usually is not correct because, often you change the sizes, you change the resolutions, and obviously then the default settings don't work. So the most important setting with these PBR textures is usually displacement, because when the displacement is not the right height for what this material is supposed to have, your materials can easily either look super flat, like almost like an old video game texture from the 90s, or it's just way too spiky. I'm gonna show you what I mean. Here in this scene I have this 4K texture of dry cracked clay, which is on the ground here. And here this is the value that I used that I think look the best. However, by default in Octane everything gets imported in 10 centimeters height, and if I do that, and as you can see, all of these cracks here almost are not visible anymore. And if we go even lower, for example 1 centimeter, now you know what I'm talking about. This looks like a flat video game texture that only pretty much reacts to normals, because it does have a normal map. If I turn that off as well, we get a completely flat texture. So make sure to use all the channels that these Quixel materials or any asset library materials come with, just to get the most realism out of it, and then play around with the displacement until you're happy with what you have. Make sure to not have it too high either, because for example, if I make this texture smaller now, let's say 10 times smaller, of course the height stays the same and therefore everything looks a lot more spiky. So let's increase this to 100 centimeters now. You see, now here we have these really weird spikes going on. These are like pebbles on the ground that are usually a lot higher than these cracks. And now we have a lot of detail going on, but it totally looks off. So over here I just played around with the slider until it looked right, and it was about 32 centimeters, maybe actually a little bit less, but this works as well. Next on the materials as well, make sure that the specular and roughness is also correct, because that can also make or break your scene. You have to think about what your material is supposed to show. So in this case, this is a very dry desert, therefore the ground has to be dry as well. If I now decrease the roughness and increase the specular, what we will get is wet cracked clay, which doesn't make too much sense in a dry desert. Of course, if it just rained, and you want to portray that, then that's fine. Then do that, it looks great therefore. But if you want to portray a dry desert, make sure that your specular and roughness values are correct to something that looks believable. Number 2, your scene lights are not bright enough. And I'm not talking about passive lighting, I'm talking about active lighting. And here I opened up a scene called Heartline Hotel, which was one of my everydays, and I changed some values to make it look like the scenario I'm talking about. Here, as you can see, the neon is definitely bright enough for the camera to get a bloom effect, so the neon itself looks great. However, the rest of the scene kind of doesn't look quite right. It's very dark, it doesn't have a lot of detail, it's just overall like missing something. And what is it? So because the camera here has a high bloom value, it is able to bloom out this very not highly lit up sign. If we decrease the bloom light here a little bit, you can see what's going on more now. The neon lights are simply not bright enough to light the scene, and that's the next point. So make sure that your active lights in the scene light your actual scene, or at least look like it. You can use passive lights or invisible lights to fake that look, but make sure that the lighting in your scene, like the neon sign here for example, or the windows here, can make a bright enough light to light your scene in nice ambience. So let's do that right now. Let's increase the hotel sign to something a lot higher, maybe like 60. As well as the blue heartline sign as well, for example, let's go with like 40. And as you can see now, even though we turn down the bloom effect, we still get a nice bloom effect here because the neon signs are a lot brighter, but now they light the entire scene a lot more realistically. While this sometimes is not the key to photorealism, it is definitely the key to a nice moody render. Number 3 on the list is lighting. And we're specifically talking here about realistic outdoor daylight, which I've seen a lot of people struggle with, including myself up until a couple of months ago. To show you what I mean is I imported here a regular HDRI into Octane Render with the regular properties of 1 brightness, and I left everything as it comes by default. Now, what you might think, okay, the sky actually looks pretty good, but the scene just looks really dark. What are you gonna do? You could use fake lights, you could use a different HDRI, or you bump the HDRI up to a very, very, very high value. And so let's go, for example, with 5. 5 looks already quite good. It's just still a little bit dark. So let's try something even higher. Let's try 15. And now if we have the brightness of 15, now we have a really nice ambient light going on in our scene that looks rather realistic. However, what's the problem? The sky is completely blown out. It's completely white. What can you do to fix that? You just load in a second HDRI and set that to a visible environment. Now the second HDRI is only visible. It won't affect the light of the scene. So now here you can set this HDRI back to the original value where you enjoyed the look of the sky. So if we turn that on now, as you can see now, we got a very bright scene light, but still the nice details of the clouds of the regular HDRI. Although here I think it's still a little bit too dark. You know, you have to be careful to match the brightness to the sky roughly. So let's go maybe with 2, which gets rid of a little bit of detail, but it still keeps in the clouds and everything, making everything look quite nice. By the way, this also works with the regular Octane daylight. You just load in your daylight, pump up the power to like 10, and then you're good to go for super nice realistic daylight renders without using an HDRI. And here I also come in with the 4th point, which is the camera settings, or rather exposure and gamma settings. This is a big thing for daylight renders, because over here I have used a OCIO called Rec 709, which is kind of like a fake color space that is almost like a LUT. It's comparable to a LUT. And this LUT or OCIO here really balances out the gamma and exposure to an almost perfect setting for daylight renders. However, I'll show you what it looks like without the Rec 709 preset by just going from my OCIO setting over to regular HDRI sRGB setting. As you can see, not a lot has changed, but for example, our sky is completely blown out again. These red LEDs and red lights look very weird, and overall it makes the whole render look super flat. That is why I personally, for any type of realism renders, I always use some form of OCIO, either an ACES OCIO or my favorite one is the Rec 709 OCIO. So let's go back into the OCIO and compare the two. As you can see, this OCIO, for example, really balances our exposure and gamma. By the way, this is not a camera setting. As you can see, the exposure and gamma are still exactly the same. This happens all in render. Unfortunately, with these OCIOs turned on, you're not able to change the gamma anymore. You're only able to change the exposure, but you're not able to change the gamma, which, you know, to some extent is really good because you don't want to mess up this whole nice setting. And lastly, number 5 of the most common render mistakes I see online is when plants are too saturated. I see a lot of artists going after high saturation to make it pop more, but when you go for realism, that can really break the whole image, because no plant looks like this in real life unless you have some crazy camera settings going on or a lot of post editing. But however, I gotta say that all of these assets that I'm using here for plants from Quixel look exactly like this when you import them by default. And this is exactly why I explained lighting previously. So since we now have this super bright HDRI or super bright daylight, our transmission that goes through these leaves in this case is also way too bright. So first of all, we gotta turn down the transmission brightness and then also the transmission saturation. And if that is not enough, then you also have to change that in the albedo settings. So here, for example, for these needle trees right here in the back, I have already loaded in a color correction into the transmission channel where the texture is in. So these are of course not the default values, but I changed them a little bit for the sake of this video. So let's go put the saturation down to half, for example. As you can see, that already makes a really big difference, and now our trees look a lot more realistic. If you go into a forest nowadays that has maybe even a little rainy weather or anything like that, they are not bright acid green, but they have a very distinct, very desaturated sort of green, olivey kind of color, and you can get that with that. Of course, our trees are now still a little bit too bright because there's too much light coming through the leaves. So let's pump up the gamma a little bit to make them a little darker. Now, of course, this was a little too much. Let's maybe go with 1.3. And as you can see now, these values change to a rather nice look. So let's do the same with our bushes back here. So as we learned, we go into our saturation first, put that to something like 0.2. Maybe that's a little bit too little. Let's go 0.5. And then also turn the gamma up to like 1 point. Let's try 1.4. Maybe that's too much. That looks about right. And lastly, we also do that for our seaweed, which I use a lot for like grass. I know it's technically not the correct thing, but it looks good when you use it right. So seaweed to go. Let's go 0.2 maybe. And now, as you can see here, the seaweed is still too bright. So let's pump up the gamma here as well to something like 1.5. And now we have a more realistic looking vegetation in the background. And believe it or not, but this trick can really make or break an image as well. If you have everything else made super realistic, and then all of a sudden there is like a super bright, super saturated plant somewhere, it just looks off. So these are 5 common rendering mistakes. As you saw, a lot of these mistakes are very easy to fix. It's just sometimes a little hard to figure stuff out. So if this video helped you figure this stuff out, please make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below. It would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and peace out.